Chapter 5. Eye Contact. Havilah never smiled without reason. Her emotions had become a luxury she rarely allowed herself to indulge in after seeing what they could end up causing. Good or bad, it was a lack of self-control, and it wasn't a weakness she could allow herself anymore. Yet as she found herself alone, she gave herself the treat of happiness at the sight of water. It wasn't a safe place for her. In fact, most of her encounters with the grim on her own took place near bodies of water. Yet it was always a place she felt safe. All she needed to survive in the desert was here. And in that, there was a promise of longer life she couldn't find anywhere else. Sheathing her knife in her back pocket, she prepared both of her hands to support her, as she would soon enjoy dunking her face into the oasis. She quickly regretted this indulgence into her emotions when it stole her awareness of her surroundings. She tripped over an object and ended up face first in the sand. Her ears hung low as they protruded from the sand as she slowly picked herself up. She wasn't injured. She simply kicked herself for not paying more attention. Not a full day had passed since her tears ended up risking the lives of innocent people. Now she had humiliated herself. At least she was alone. Shaking off the sand, she didn't bother to consider the object and made her way to the water with a renewed sense of self-discipline. With one hand holding her knife, she reached down with one hand to cup the water instead of shoving her face in as originally planned. This ended up paying off when she realized something was approaching. Her ears darted to where the noise was coming from and realized it wasn't a grim. Her eyes went immediately to the shape of the possible enemy and found it to be a human. A male human, after further assessment. However, the moment she met his eyes, something was wrong. She saw blackness. A blackness so thick that it even went into his irises. She suddenly felt cold, held back from something important, like being withheld from a life-saving meal that was available for her to take. Before her instinct set her into a flight or flight response, the boy turned his head and went to the object she had previously tripped over. Covering his eyes as if he had walked in on her changing, he put what she now realized was a helmet on his head and quickly drew down its visor. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air until he decided to break the silence. "Miss," pausing briefly, assuming it was allowing her to introduce herself. Not responding to his question, she instead asked her own. "What was that?" The boy was facing the other direction voluntarily, but turned slightly her direction considering how to respond. "I think all you need to know right now is that there's a reason I wear this visor." Familiar with it already, she smirked and sarcastically retorted, "Keeping sand out of your face, right? Answer my question." With a sigh, he turned around and began walking towards her. The blade in his hand came into view, and she became more and more uncomfortable by his mere presence. Aware of this, he continued on until he passed her and went to the pool behind her. She kept her eyes on his sword as he drank, then narrowed her eyes as he drew breath to speak. Suddenly a large splash sounded that drew both of their attention as well as their weapons. This was the second time she had allowed herself to have her attention drawn away from her environment. Apparently that one night's sleep indoors had made her sloppy. Despite all of this being in her head, she saw the boy with the sword let out a groan as if he was frustrated with himself for the same reasons. Her knife remained in an aggressive stance, waiting for whatever had jumped in the water to charge. Stress built in her mind to the point where she was about to take the initiative and charge the monster in the water herself. Before she acted on this drive, she saw the boy in front of her relax as if he suddenly knew something she didn't. Then, emerging from the water, a large and loud human emerged laughing until he saw her. His laughter was cut off, and he slowly raised his hands. She didn't lower her knife or alter her glare in any way. Internally, however, she was concluding that, since he wasn't a grim, he wasn't a threat, at least not in his current state. He was heavily armored, which would make him slow, and the fact he was submerged in water only compounded her advantages over him. "Name's Daniel. I believe we've met before." She didn't recall, nor was she willing to allow herself to be distracted again. Her ears began shifting to take in the noises around her, and slowly lowered the knife. "Were you two the first to see each other?" The boy who lowered his blade nodded. "Yes, we met eyes first." She heard weight to what he was saying, that she both understood as a caution not to let it happen again, as well as something she wasn't following with. Sensing the mood, Daniel nodded slightly and began shuffling out of the water. "All right, then. That makes 4 of us." The boy tilted his head and laughed. "All right, then. My name's Gideon." When Daniel finally emerged from the water, Havilah finally saw what Gideon had just discovered. A short and skinny girl was hanging onto Daniel's armor like a stuffed animal. A makeshift spear was slung over her back, and she showed no signs of wanting to move from where she was. "I'm warm," she stated matter-of-factly as Daniel continued to shuffle his way out of the water unimpeded. "This is Olivia. She likes how my armor feels when the sun heats it up. I think it's best just to leave her be." Slightly irritated by her slothfulness, Havilah felt the need to protest, but figured they had wasted enough time already. "So we're pairing up then?" Gideon and Daniel nodded. The goal was 4, and here we are, shaking Olivia a bit to stir her attention. "Make a weapon and use it. Here's what I found." Daniel went back to where he jumped into the water and picked up a makeshift hammer tied together with the same material that bound Olivia's spear to her back. Havilah and Gideon gestured to their blades. "We both had these when we started." Daniel laughed. "If it's not broken, don't fix it, eh? Very well. Let's find some beasties to use them on." As brash as he was, Havilah couldn't help but get caught up in his enthusiasm. "Very well indeed. Would you like to find some for us?" Gideon stood at a distance, averting his head from all of them as he seemed so accustomed to doing. Lowering his visor, she realized he wasn't looking away from them on principle. "It looks like they have found us." Daniel turned and smiled as Olivia quickly scrambled into a nearby tree. "Good. I'm not much of a navigator anyway." His armor began jostling and picking up pace as he ran to meet the large group of Beowulfs who were already at full charge. Gideon didn't move. He merely held his sword in a clumsy guard that even her amateur combat skills saw wouldn't accomplish much. Olivia was nowhere in sight, but she heard rustling nearby and decided to forget about her. All that she could control in this moment was herself, and she hoped that the knife she was given would be enough. It was times like these that Havilah was grateful she was too young to fight in the Great War. As she was, she had more aptitude running from conflicts rather than dealing with them personally. Nevertheless, if running was what she was good at, she'd find a way to make it useful here. The rocks gave her lots of spaces to maneuver, so she picked up her stride, bounding from rock to rock, allowing the Grimm to use their own momentum as her weapon. Every time she saw one slam into a rock face where she used to be, she'd redouble her efforts and rush back with her knife to put the beast down. She kept moving, always moving. It was all she knew, and it was what was keeping her alive. Curious, her eyes wandered to where Daniel ran and saw him treating the monsters that were threatening his life like an older brother manhandling younger siblings. He didn't have the grace to put them down quietly, but his rock tied to a stick was doing its job. Her eyes eventually found Gideon on his own and made the effort to support him. However, the closer she got, the more she realized he had things handled. His blade seemed to be doing all the work, and it was the work that needed to be done. His body movements were more for the purpose of keeping a distance from the creatures as his swings and strokes cut and maimed wherever they struck. She kept running, but couldn't help but be drawn to watch the creatures being cut down so casually by his blade, when it was apparent he couldn't call himself any more of a swordsman than she could call herself a knife fighter. They were alive. The only thing that escaped her sight was where Olivia had gone. Doubling back to the oasis, Grimm tumbled over rocks as well as one another in an attempt to keep pace with her. Finally, reaching the tree, Havilah began calling, "Olivia! Where are you? We need help!" No sooner had she said those words that its need became apparent. 3 Beowulfs had caught up with her despite her maneuvers and began to charge her. There was nowhere to misdirect them, and all that stood behind her was the lone tree sustained by the oasis. She began assessing her options, including the instinct to simply draw them back into the rocks. Yet as more and more Grimm approached, she found herself surrounded. Gideon and Daniel had their own problems to deal with. She was on her own. Accepting this, she tightened her grip on the knife to prepare herself for whatever she would need to do next. As she raised her blade to meet the threat of the first Grimm to close the distance, it suddenly fell back and knocked over those that came behind it. Throwing back her shoulders and straightening her back, she looked around to see what had just happened. Running over to the stunned monsters, she began to thrust her knife into each of them until she came to the one that knocked over the others. Examining the body as quickly as their situation allowed, she found a dried but taut vine caught in its legs. She followed the trail a few meters further and saw a familiar sight. A spear, tied to the vines, had embedded itself in the ground, as if thrown by something bigger than a Goliath. The spear suddenly began twitching and bending in the ground, immediately putting Havaliah back on guard. A voice then came from the stick. "Can you help me pull this out?" Havaliah didn't move, but merely blinked in response to apparently what was happening. She didn't respond. "What are you—" "Oh, sorry, I forgot." Olivia missed it into existence before her and kept pulling on the spear. "Can you help me reset the trap? I want to do it again. Wasn't that awesome?" Olivia's bubbly personality didn't sit well with her, but it was probably the situation they had found themselves in that put her on edge. Another Beowulf approached, more cautious than his fellows, and roared in challenge. No time. Havaliah began looking for a way to get out of the situation, and still found none that wouldn't end up leaving Olivia behind. She recalled how the trap Olivia apparently had been setting while she couldn't be seen and focused on the dried vines. Taking her knife and cutting off a section, she tossed her knife to Olivia and began running towards the Grim. "Can you get that plant to stay on the knife?" Olivia caught the knife and stared blankly for a moment. She was worried she didn't understand. Diving below the beast's legs and escaping its attempt to grab her, she looked back briefly and met eyes with her. She wasn't staring blankly anymore. Olivia gave a slow but sharp grin and began wrapping the vine around the handle of her knife. Ducking and weaving in between the Beowulf strokes and swipes, she kept herself sprinting and ducking wherever and whenever she needed to in order to stay alive. A fox lady!" Olivia struggled as she sought her attention. She caught the reference and turned back. The Beowulf's chest was heaving, but still angry enough to attempt another slash at her now that she had stopped moving. As the beast's claw drew back, the knife appeared through the center of its palm. Reminding her of what had taken place yesterday, she ran towards the beast and grabbed the rope that was now embedded into the monster's claw. Upon jumping, she realized that this one was bigger than the others and almost failed to reach it. Taking the rope in her hands and running with it, she made a full lap around the monster's legs and began to pull. Olivia, caught in her enthusiasm, rushed over and began pulling along with her. The beast was immobile at the moment, but more out of shock than their efforts. Havaliah couldn't pull it down. Even with Olivia's help, they couldn't get the beast off his feet where she could put it down. She let go of the rope and began running to look for another option. Yet no sooner had she given up on pulling that Daniel slammed his shoulder into the beast and put his full body weight into holding it down. Taking her time to stop herself and turn around, she saw Olivia and Daniel both struggling with the Grim that was starting to get back up. She thought as quickly as she could of what could help them all stay alive, and remembered that Gideon and Daniel were both fighting in the same place. "Gideon!" Havaliah shouted, hoping the tone itself would let him know they were in trouble. She drew breath to call in again, but looked back at Daniel and saw him getting off of the monster. Looking to examine why, a massive white spike was seen in the beast's forehead. It began dissolving along with the beast itself. This piqued Havaliah's curiosity now that she had the luxury. It didn't sound like any more Grim were nearby, so she walked to Daniel without taking her eyes off of the spike. "What happened?" Havaliah asked Daniel, finally coming to what was left of the beast corpse. "That doesn't look like your—" Daniel laughed between breaths. "Probably still in that pile over there. You gave an order. Are you surprised he listened to it?" Havaliah took her eyes off of the now dissipated Grim and onto him. "Why are you so tired?" Daniel kept breathing heavily. "Why aren't you?" She had never thought about it. She was moving more than any of them in the last couple minutes and figured it was always normal to keep moving when you needed to. Her ears twitched, looking for another person, and suddenly became anxious. Turning around, she saw Gideon on a nearby rock with the blade of his sword hacked off at the hilt. She was concerned that he had sacrificed his weapon forever just for the sake of putting down one Grim, until she saw it starting to grow back.